My family ignored me for 23 years and saved $80,000 for my sister while I paid my own college. Years later, they went broke and begged me for money. But when I discovered they used it for her luxuries, I charged them legal interest and exposed them. They never expected their ATM to become their worst nightmare. I'm 28 years old. I work in corporate finance, and I still don't understand how my family thought they could use me as an ATM forever without me eventually saying enough. But anyway, I guess I should start from the beginning. So this makes sense. Because the truth is, this story didn't start a few months ago when everything exploded. But like 23 years ago when I was born and my life became my younger sister's show, I have vague memories of when I was an only child. I mean, the first 5 years of my life. But honestly, I don't know if they're real memories or just things I imagined, because I wanted to believe I was once important to my parents. What I do remember perfectly is the day they brought Danielle home from the hospital. I was 5 years old and I was super excited because I was going to have a little sister. You know, someone to play with and share my toys with and all that. My parents arrived with her wrapped in a pink blanket, and I remember my mom told me, "You have to be very careful with your little sister because she's special." And I thought at that moment that all babies were special. But turns out no. Danielle was special with a capital S, and I basically stopped existing that same day. It wasn't gradual, you know what I mean? It was like a switch that turned off, and suddenly everything in the house revolved around Danielle. When she cried at night, my mom would run to take care of her, and if I woke up and asked for water or whatever, they'd tell me I was already big enough and could go myself. My dad, who used to take me to the park on Saturdays, now stayed home because Danielle needed this or that. And look, I understand babies need attention. I'm not stupid. But this never changed. When Danielle grew up and stopped being a baby, the dynamic stayed exactly the same. When I was like 10 years old and Danielle was 5, she started gymnastics classes. She was good. I'm not going to lie. But it's not like she was the next Simone Biles or anything like that. But my parents acted like they had a future Olympic medalist living at home. Every weekend we had to go to her competitions. Every vacation was planned around her training schedule. Every conversation at the table was about her jumps and her routines. I could get straight A's in school, and my parents would say something like, "Oh, that's nice, honey," while they kept watching videos of Danielle's practices on their phones. The worst came when I was in 7th grade. My class was going on a trip to Washington, D.C., and I was super excited because we'd been fundraising all year and it was like the big experience of the grade. But turns out the trip coincided with one of Danielle's gymnastics competitions in another state, and my parents told me I couldn't go to Washington because they needed me to stay and help with Danielle. When I say help, I mean they basically wanted me to be her personal assistant, carrying her backpack, preparing her snacks, recording videos of her routines. I begged them, literally begged them on my knees, but my mom just told me Danielle needed me and that there would be more school trips in the future. Spoiler alert. There were never more trips like that. And to this day, I can feel that sensation in my stomach when all my friends got on the bus and I had to stay behind watching them leave. And the most twisted thing of all is that after that weekend, Danielle didn't even win her competition. She placed like 4th or something, but my parents still acted like she'd conquered the world. I swallowed all my sadness and resentment because what was I going to do? I was 12 years old and completely dependent on them. Things got really tense when Danielle was like 13. One day, she was practicing at home, because of course we had bars and mats in the garage, and she fell badly and broke her wrist. I wasn't even home. I was at the library doing a project with Morgan, my best friend since forever. But when I got home like 3 hours later, my parents, we were furious with me. My dad yelled at me about why I hadn't been there to take care of my sister, that it was my responsibility to make sure she was okay. I tried to explain that I had my own life and my own things, but he just kept saying I was the older sister and I should put Danielle first. My mom was crying, saying that Danielle's gymnastics career was ruined because of me, as if I'd literally gone and broken her wrist myself. Danielle never competed again after that. The wrist healed fine and everything, but she decided she didn't want to do gymnastics anymore. And honestly, I think my parents felt relieved to have a new narrative. Danielle, the promising athlete whose career was prematurely destroyed. It was more dramatic, you know what I mean? And of course, they found ways to make me feel guilty about it for years. Fast forward to when I was 17 and applying to colleges. I had worked super hard in school, not because my parents pushed me, they never did, but because it was the Fidium sting. The only way I saw to eventually get out of that house. I had a 3.8 gigapascals. I was on the honor roll. I'd done community service, the whole thing. I got accepted to a pretty good state university about 2 hours from home, and I was so excited. But when I told my parents I would need help with tuition, they laughed. Literally laughed in my face. My dad told me, "You're already 18. It's time you learn to fend for yourself, and you can get a job at the mall or something." I asked if they were joking. How was I supposed to pay for college working at the mall? And my mom just shrugged and said others did it, that it wasn't impossible. But the part that really destroyed me was when Danielle, who was sitting there listening to all this, told me, "Well, college isn't for everyone either. Maybe you're just not as smart as you think." She was 13 years old and had already perfectly learned how to treat me like garbage. I cried so much that night I thought my eyes were going to hurt forever. Morgan came to my house and hugged me while I basically had a nervous breakdown, because all my life I'd worked to be able to go to college and get out of there, and now it seemed completely impossible. But then Morgan did something that changed my life. She took me to her house and talked to her parents, Eric and Susan, who owned a pretty successful local bakery. She explained the situation, and they made me a proposal. They would pay my full tuition if I worked for them part-time during college, helping with administration and catering. They told me I could pay them back when I could, no rush, no interest, just when I was in a position to do so. I cried again, but this time with relief. I accepted immediately and promised them they wouldn't regret it, and they didn't regret it. I worked my butt off during those 4 years, literally carried 18 credits per semester and worked 25 hours a week at the bakery, but I did it. Not only that, but I ended up being really good at the catering business. I expanded that part of the business like 3 times during my time there, got contracts with big companies in the city, organized huge events. Eric and Susan told me many times that I had transformed their business, and when I graduated, I'd already paid back every penny they'd lent me, plus extra for interest, even though they didn't ask for it. During those 4 years, I barely talked to my parents. They'd call me from time to ask how I was, but the conversations always ended up being about Danielle. Danielle this, Danielle that. Danielle needs something new. Danielle is thinking about studying this or that. I'd just respond with monosyllables until they eventually hung up. Morgan told me I should cut contact completely, but I still had that stupid hope that someday my parents would realize what they'd done and want to repair our relationship. The summer before my last year of college, I went home for a family meal because it was my paternal grandmother's birthday, and that's when I found out something that made me sick to my stomach. Turns out my parents had been saving for Danielle's college since she was born. They had a complete college fund for her, like $80,000 or more. I'm not sure of the exact amount, but it was a lot. My aunt mentioned it casually, saying something like, "How lucky Danielle is that you guys planned her future so well." And I just sat there, frozen, with my fork halfway to my mouth. I asked my mom if that was true, and she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She just nodded and said, "Well, yes. We always knew Danielle would go to college and we wanted to be prepared." And I exploded. I yelled at them how was it possible they had all that money saved for her when they'd told me to screw off and find a job at the mall. My dad got angry and told me not to use that language at the table, and that the situation was different because when I entered college they didn't have the means, but now they did. It was a lie. Obviously, because they'd started saving for Danielle since she was born. I mean, when I was 5 years old. They just never considered I deserved the same investment. I left that meal and didn't talk to them for months. Danielle sent me a message telling me I was being dramatic and that I should be happy for her instead of being bitter. I didn't respond. Things stayed that way until I graduated. I got an incredible job at a financial consulting firm thanks to a contact I'd made during my catering years. A man named Mr. Cooper had used our services for corporate events, and he was super impressed with how I handled everything. He offered me an entry-level position at his company with a salary that almost made me fall off my chair when I saw it. It was like 3 times more than I'd expected to earn fresh out of college. I accepted immediately and moved to the city to a small but decent apartment. 6 months after starting that job, my parents called me for the first time in over a year. My mom sounded super sweet on the phone, asking how I was, telling me they missed me, the whole thing. I knew they wanted something, because that wasn't their normal style, but I still played along. Eventually they got to the point. They needed financial help. They explained that Danielle had met a guy named Trevor in college who came from a super rich family, and they were getting married. They wanted to help with the wedding, but their savings were committed to Danielle's college, which, obviously, she was in her second year, and they wondered if I could contribute. Something in me broke at that moment, but in a strange way. Instead of hanging up or sending them to hell, I told them I'd think about it. And I actually did think about it. I thought about all the times they'd ignored me, all the times they'd put Danielle first, all the times they'd made me feel worthless. And I decided that if they wanted to use me as an ATM, I was going to let them. But on my terms. I told them I couldn't give them money directly, but that I could give them access to a credit card of mine with a limit of $1,500 a month. I explained it was for emergencies and expenses related to Danielle, and that I would pay the balance each month. My parents were delighted and thanked me like 1,000 times. Danielle even sent me a message saying, "Thanks, sis," with a heart emoji, which was basically the nicest interaction we'd had in years. Over the next few months, they used the card regularly. I'd see the charges in my banking app but didn't say anything. They were normal things at first. Food, gas, some gifts for Danielle. I could handle it, though it definitely bothered me to see my money going to them when they'd never done anything for me. But anyway, I'd established that limit and I maintained it. Everything changed like 4 months ago. I was checking my statement and saw they'd maxed out the card several months in a row. The charges were increasingly extravagant. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, jewelry. I contacted my bank to see the complete history and almost fell off my chair. In the last 18 months, they'd spent over $50,000. How? Turns out they'd discovered they could do cash advances from the card, and they'd been withdrawing cash up to the limit, and then using that cash to pay for other things. I'd been so busy with my work, literally working 70 hours a week, that I hadn't paid enough attention to the details. But the part that really made me sick was when I started investigating more and saw charges from a travel agency. I looked up the agency's name on Google and called them pretending to be my mom, saying I needed to confirm some reservation details. The woman on the other end gave me all the information. A trip to Monaco for 4 people, 5-star hotel, first-class flights, private tours, the complete package. The date of the trip was in 2 months. And when I asked who was going, she gave me 4 names. My mom, my dad, Danielle, and Trevor. I wasn't included. They'd planned this massive, super luxurious trip to celebrate Danielle's engagement, and they hadn't even mentioned to me that it existed. They spent my money. Money I'd earned working my butt off to finance a dream vacation I wasn't even invited to. I sat in my apartment that night and I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I eventually did both. Morgan came over that night because I sent her a message that said, "I need you to come now." And when I told her what I'd discovered, she was furious. She told me I had to confront them, that I had to cancel everything, that I had to cut them off completely. But I still wasn't ready. I still had that little voice in my head saying, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe they were going to surprise you with the invitation. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. That little voice died completely 2 weeks later. Danielle called me, which was weird, because she never called me. I answered, and she sounded super excited, talking a mile a minute about the Monaco trip, about how Trevor had proposed to her at a super elegant restaurant, about how his future in-laws were incredible and generous. I let her talk and talk, just waiting for her to mention something about me, about including me, whatever. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "You know, Amanda, I really appreciate everything you've done for us financially. Seriously. It makes me feel good knowing that even though you're not really part of the family in the traditional sense, you can still contribute in important ways. You're like our personal wallet, and that has value, you know?" I stayed silent for a moment, processing what she'd just said. I asked her what she meant by I wasn't part of the family in the traditional sense, and she laughed, like it was obvious. She said, "Oh, Amanda, don't be sensitive. You know, Mom and Dad have their own thing with the 3 of us, and you've always been kind of the outsider. But it's okay, because you find other ways to be useful, like with money." I hung up without saying anything else. My hands were shaking so much, I almost dropped the phone. Something broke in me at that moment, something that had been holding me together for years. This pathetic hope that someday my family would see me as something more than an employee or a source of money. But not anymore. It was over. The first thing I did was call the travel agency. I explained that I was the one who had paid for the trip, which was true, technically. since it was my card, and that I needed to cancel everything. The woman got somewhat complicated at first, talking about cancellation policies and charges, but when I explained the situation and gave her all the card details and transactions, she eventually agreed. She canceled the flights, the hotel, the tours, everything. And they told me I'd get back like 60% of the money after cancellation fees, which was better than nothing. Then I called the bank and deactivated the card immediately. I also put alerts on all my accounts and changed all my passwords because I no longer trusted that they didn't have access to more of my stuff. I spent that whole night making sure they couldn't touch anything else of my money. For a week, nothing happened. Not a message, not a call, nothing. I knew it was because they still hadn't realized I'd canceled everything. And honestly, that week of silence was perfect. It gave me time to prepare for what I knew was coming. The explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon. My mom called me screaming, literally screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She was telling me, how dare I, that I'd ruined Danielle's trip, that I was a horrible and selfish person. When I tried to speak, she just screamed louder. My dad took the phone and told me I should be ashamed of myself, that Danielle was devastated, that Trevor was questioning everything. I told them, very calmly, to check the statements and see how much of my money they'd spent without my permission, to check how they'd completely excluded me from a trip I was paying for, to think about how they'd treated me my entire life. My dad said I was exaggerating, that they'd always treated me well, that I was ungrateful. I hung up at that point. Danielle sent me like 50 text messages, varying between insulting me and begging me to reconsider. She told me I'd ruined her life, that Trevor was going to break up with her, that all this was my fault. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I just read them and archived them. What I didn't expect was for Trevor and his parents to find out about all the drama. Turns out when my family tried to explain why the trip had been canceled, they had to admit they'd been using my money without my real knowledge of how they were spending it. Trevor's parents, apparently, are pretty decent people and were horrified. Trevor called Danielle and basically told her that if her family was like that, he didn't want to be part of it. He broke off the engagement like a week after I canceled the trip. Danielle blamed me. Obviously. She sent me a long message telling me I'd destroyed her life, that I'd ruined her future, that she wished I'd never been born. I responded for the first and last time. I hope you learn that people aren't ATMs and that actions have consequences. Good luck with everything. And I blocked her everywhere. My parents came to my apartment like 2 weeks later. I don't know how they got my address, but there they were, knocking on my door on a Saturday morning. I didn't open it. They stayed there like half an hour, knocking and yelling through the door, saying we needed to talk, that this was ridiculous, that I was being immature. I called building security and asked them to escort them out. When the guard arrived, my parents told him I was their daughter and they were worried about me, but I told the guard I didn't want to see them and that if they came back, I'd call the police. They eventually left. Morgan told me I should consider making all this public, like sharing my story on social media, because she thought people needed to know what kind of people they were. At first, I resisted because I didn't want public drama, but then I thought, you know what? I don't care anymore about protecting their reputation. I wrote everything in a long Facebook post, including screenshots of the statements with sensitive information blurred out. Obviously, screenshots of Danielle's messages, everything. I shared it and made it public. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared my story, left supportive comments, told me I'd done the right thing. Some people knew my family and left their own comments about things they'd seen over the years, validating everything I'd said. My family tried to do damage control, posting their own versions of events, but nobody believed them because I'd shown real proof. The last I heard from them was like a month ago. My paternal grandmother called me, the only person in the family who was always kind to me, and told me my parents wanted to apologize. I told her I appreciated her letting me know, but I wasn't interested. She told me she understood, that she'd seen how they treated me for years and that she regretted not intervening more. I told her it wasn't her fault, that she'd always been good to me and that I loved her. It was the last conversation I had with anyone from my family. Now I'm here, 28 years old, living my life without the constant toxicity of my family. My job is going amazingly. I got promoted 2 months ago, and now I'm earning more than I ever thought I'd earn. I have my own beautiful apartment. I have friends who really care about me, And for the first time in my life, I don't have that constant feeling in my stomach that I'm not enough. Eric and Susan are still like my adoptive parents. We have dinner together once a month and they treat me with more love and respect than my own parents ever gave me. Sometimes I feel guilty. I'm not going to lie. There are nights when I wonder if I was too harsh, if I should have given them another chance, if somehow I contributed to the problem. But then I remember that one 2-year-old girl who had to miss her school trip, or that one 8-year-old who was told to get a job at the mall while her parents had $80,000 saved for her sister, or that 7-year-old woman whose own sister called her a personal wallet. And then the guilt disappears. Last week, I was at a coffee shop, working on my laptop, and a woman approached me. She told me she'd read my story online and that it had inspired her to cut contact with her own toxic family. She thanked me for sharing my experience and told me that seeing someone else set boundaries had given her the courage to do the same. We both cried right there in the middle of the coffee shop, and I realized that everything I went through might have been worth it if I could help even one person. Understand that it's okay to walk away from people who hurt you, even if those people are your family. I don't know what happened to my parents or Danielle after all this. I blocked all their social media, changed my phone number, basically erased them from my life. Morgan keeps me updated if she hears anything through mutual acquaintances. But honestly, I'm not as interested anymore as I used to be. It's like I finally closed a door that had been open for 28 years, letting in cold drafts and making me feel miserable. And now that it's closed, I can finally be warm and comfortable. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if they'd loved me the way they loved Danielle. If they'd given me even a little bit of the attention, the resources, the affection they gave her. But then I realize I probably wouldn't have met Morgan, or Eric and Susan, or wouldn't have developed this fierce independence I have now. I wouldn't have learned to value myself because nobody else did. I wouldn't have built this life I love so much, free from people who only see me as a source of money or service. Last Christmas. The first one I spent completely alone without any family contact. I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and asked myself if I felt lonely. And the answer was no. I felt at peace. Morgan and her parents had invited me to spend the day with them, but I needed that time alone to process everything, to close that chapter completely. I ordered Chinese food, watched bad movies on Netflix, and slept until noon on the 26th. It was perfect. I'm not going to pretend everything is rosy now. I still have days when I miss the idea of having a family, even though the reality was never what I wanted it to be. It still hurts when I see other people with their families on social media, celebrating together, supporting each other. But those moments are less and less frequent, and when they come, I already know how to handle them better. I text Morgan, or call Eric and Susan, or just remind myself that I'm worth more than the treatment they gave me all those years. My therapist, yes, I went to therapy after all this, told me something that stuck with me. She told me that sometimes the family you choose is more real than the family you're born into, and that there's no shame in recognizing that the people who gave you biological life don't necessarily deserve a place in your emotional life. It took me months to really understand what that meant, but now I understand it perfectly. Yesterday, my boss offered me an incredible opportunity to transfer to our Seattle office with a significant salary increase. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I already know I'm going to accept. There's nothing tying me to this city beyond Morgan and her parents, and they already told me it would be super selfish of them to ask me to reject an opportunity like that. Morgan joked that she'd finally have an excuse to visit Seattle and eat at all the restaurants she sees on Instagram. We laughed. But then she hugged me and told me she was proud of me, of how far I'd come, of the strength I'd shown. And I realized that recognition from someone who really loves me is worth more than 1,000 apologies from my family. So I guess here I am, ready to start over in a new city, with a new life, without the weight of 23 years of being the forgotten daughter, and honestly, I can't wait.